Tonight on Nightfall Royals, we journey back to France to follow the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, from his early childhood in Corsica to his rise as one of the world's most famous leaders. This gentle narrative blends history and calm reflection. It's designed for peaceful listening. It's the perfect bedtime story to help you relax and drift into sleep. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there? I'd love to hear in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where in the world you're joining from. If this story brings you rest, please like and subscribe for more relaxing sleep stories for adults. I sing you a quiet night under the same stars Napoleon once saw on his campaigns. As twilight settles over the Mediterranean, let us drift toward the island of Corsica, a rugged land of mountains and fragrant olive groves, where sea winds whisper against rocky shores. It was here, in the town of Ajaccio, that Napoleon Bonaparte first opened his eyes on the 15th day of August in the year 1769. Corsica itself was a land caught between worlds. For centuries, it had been a place of struggle, where empires sought control and local families cherished independence. Only a year before Napoleon's birth, the island had passed from the rule of Genoa into the possession of France. The transfer was still fresh, and the spirit of resistance stirred strongly among Corsican patriots. To be born there at such a moment meant to inherit both pride and tension, a feeling of belonging to a homeland marked by resilience. Napoleon's family belonged to the minor nobility of Corsica. They were not wealthy, but they held dignity and connection. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer, educated in Pisa, loyal at times to Corsican independence, but ultimately pragmatic in aligning with France, hoping to secure opportunities for his children. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, was a woman of remarkable strength and discipline. She bore many children, 13 in total, though not all survived infancy, and managed the household with firmness, instilling in them the values of frugality, devotion, and endurance. Napoleon was the second surviving son. The family's home was modest, and their fortunes uncertain. Yet, the nobility of their lineage allowed certain privileges, including the possibility of education abroad. This would prove crucial, for though Corsica was small, Napoleon's destiny would stretch far beyond its shores. The world into which he was born was one of transition. France, newly in possession of Corsica, sought to draw the island into its fold. Tensions simmered between Corsicans who dreamed of independence and those who adapted to French governance. Carlo Bonaparte, like many others, navigated this shifting ground with care. He maintained ties to Corsican leaders, yet accepted the authority of Paris, a dual loyalty that reflected the delicate balance of survival. From his earliest years, Napoleon would breathe this air of conflict and adaptation. He would hear stories of Corsican resistance, led by figures such as Pasquale Paoli, whose dream of independence still echoed through the mountains. These memories of homeland pride, combined with his father's embrace of French patronage, created a foundation of both rebellion and pragmatism in the young boy's heart. Ajaccio, though small, was lively with Mediterranean trade in the mingling of cultures. Italian dialects, French influence, and Corsican traditions coexisted in its streets. The Bonaparte family lived within this world of crossings, where identity was never singular but layered, a blend of island pride and continental aspiration. In this setting, Napoleon's beginnings were shaped not by grandeur, but by struggle, resilience, and heritage. He was not born into the luxury of a great court, but into the modest respectability of a family striving for opportunity. The soil of Corsica, rocky and enduring, gave him his first sense of place, a land where survival required strength, and where dreams had to be larger than the island itself. The boy who would one day command armies began his life in modest simplicity. In Ajaccio, the Bonaparte household was busy with children, and Napoleon quickly learned to find his place among many siblings. He was closer to his mother than to his father. Carlo Bonaparte, ambitious but fragile in health, often sought opportunities and recognition from French officials, while Letizia ruled the home with firm discipline. She was remembered for saying that she had to be strict, for her children had no fortune but what they made themselves. Napoleon's early years were marked by the rugged environment of Corsica. He played outdoors, roamed the hills, and watched the tides of the Mediterranean. The island's atmosphere gave him resilience. In his own recollections, he later described Corsica's landscape as a cradle of independence, where pride was as natural as the mountain winds. The Bonaparte family's fortunes were often uncertain. Although Carlo's recognition as a noble allowed him certain privileges, his means were still limited. He traveled often, sometimes to the French mainland, leaving Letizia to manage the household. She was thrifty, saving whenever possible, yet generous with her children's education. Education, she believed, would raise them above the hardships of their small-town origins. Napoleon's earliest schooling was in Ajaccio, where he studied basic subjects in Italian, the language spoken at home and throughout Corsica. French was not his native tongue. In fact, his accent in French remained strong throughout his life, and in his youth he sometimes struggled with the language. This detail would follow him to military school, where classmates teased him for his Corsican origins and imperfect French. When Napoleon was 9 years old, his father secured him a place at a French school on the mainland. This was a decisive step, for it meant leaving Corsica behind and entering the broader world of French education and culture. His departure from the island was not easy. Corsica was still in his heart, and he carried its identity with him always. Carlo escorted him to the town of Autun, where the young boy was placed in a religious school to prepare him for entry into France's prestigious military academies. There, he began to study French seriously. The transition was difficult. Kay was homesick, conscious of his outsider status, and at times ridiculed for his accent and modest background. Yet, he worked diligently. Shortly thereafter, Napoleon gained admission to the military academy at Brienne-le-Château, a significant turning point in his youth. Brienne was not a place of comfort for him. Many students came from wealthier, more established noble families, and Napoleon's Corsican roots set him apart. His reserved, often solitary nature made him a target of mockery. But he endured, focusing his energy on study. At Brienne, he showed great skill in mathematics, particularly geometry. His aptitude for numbers served him well, as artillery, the military branch he would eventually join, demanded a precise mind. His interest in history and reading also deepened. He read widely about classical figures, admiring leaders such as Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Charlemagne. Their exploits filled his imagination, and he began to dream of his own destiny. Despite his progress, Napoleon was not especially polished in manners or language. Teachers noted both his brilliance and his rough edges. He was often quiet, occasionally hot-tempered, and deeply proud, yet he was determined to prove himself. His sense of identity was still strongly Corsican. He admired Pasquale Paoli, the island's resistance leader, and at times saw himself as part of that same struggle against foreign domination. When Napoleon was 15, studies at Brienne culminated in a recommendation for entry into the École Militaire in Paris, the foremost military school in France. This was a remarkable achievement for the son of a modest Corsican lawyer. The École Militaire had been founded by Louis XV to educate officers for the French army, and competition for places was intense. Napoleon was admitted thanks to his academic performance and the recognition of his noble status, though the family's finances strained to support him there. It was at this time that tragedy touched him more personally. His father, Carlo, died of stomach cancer in 1785, leaving Letizia to manage the family alone. Napoleon, only 16, was thrust further into responsibility. As the second son, he was not the head of the family, but he took his role seriously, supporting his siblings in whatever ways he could. At the École Militaire, Napoleon trained for a commission in the artillery. His time there was brief, for he completed the 2-year course in just 1 year, a mark of his determination and ability. He was appointed a second lieutenant in the artillery in 1785, stationed at Valence in southern France. In these years, Napoleon's Corsican identity remained central. He often wrote letters expressing his longing for home and his admiration for Paoli. Yet, as he wore the French uniform, a subtle transformation was beginning. He was becoming both Corsican and French, a man tied to his island roots, but also to the broader stage of European affairs. Childhood and youth for Napoleon were not gilded with luxury, but built upon hardship, study, and ambition. He carried the lessons of discipline from his mother, the hunger for opportunity from his father, and the spirit of independence from Corsica itself. These would shape his path as he stepped into the world of soldiers, revolutions, and empires. The years at Valence marked the beginning of Napoleon's transformation from student to officer. At just 16, he entered the ranks of the French artillery, one of the most technically demanding branches of the army. The work required precision, calculation, and discipline, qualities he already possessed. His sharp grasp of mathematics and his relentless focus made him an able artillery officer. At Valence, he wore his new uniform with pride, though he was still a young man far from home. Life as a junior officer was modest. His pay was limited, and he lived frugally, often writing letters to his family in Corsica, assuring them of his devotion and concern. In these letters, one hears the voice of a young man torn between ambition and loyalty to his homeland. Corsica remained at the center of his heart. He admired Pasquale Paoli, the island's leader, who had returned from exile after years in Britain. Paoli embodied Corsican independence, and Napoleon sought his approval. He returned to the island when he could, hoping to assist in the building of a free Corsican state. But Napoleon's enthusiasm did not find the welcome he expected. Paoli, wary of the Bonaparte family's ties to France, did not trust him fully. The young officer found himself caught between two worlds, French by uniform, Corsican by soul. Meanwhile, in France, the air was thick with change. The 1780s were years of financial crisis, social tension, and growing unrest. The monarchy under Louis XVI faced criticism, and whispers of revolution spread. Napoleon, still a young officer, observed these developments with keen interest. His mind was already attuned to the currents of history, and he recognized that the world around him was shifting in ways that would soon alter his own path. During his early service, he deepened his studies. How other young officers enjoyed society and diversion, Napoleon often spent his hours in reading. He immersed himself in history, philosophy, and strategy. Plutarch's lives fascinated him. The stories of ancient leaders stirred his imagination. He admired Caesar for his command of armies, Alexander for his daring conquests, and Frederick the Great for his military reforms. These figures became models in his mind, companions of thought during his solitary hours. His temperament remained intense. Some found him aloof. Others noted his sudden bursts of passion. He was not known for charm and company, but for seriousness and determination. His Corsican accent still marked him out, and he carried himself with a mixture of pride and reserve. The French Revolution broke out in 1789, when Napoleon was 20 years old. He witnessed the first tremors while stationed in Auxonne, another artillery post. The storming of the Bastille, the debates of the National Assembly, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, all of these events unfolded before him. For Napoleon, the revolution was both an opportunity and a question of loyalty. Would he align with the monarchy he served, or the new ideals of liberty and reform? His answer leaned toward the revolution. He saw in it the chance to rise on merit rather than birth. As the revolution deepened, military officers were judged less on noble heritage and more on competence, a shift that would open doors for him. Back in Corsica, however, the revolution created division. Paoli, once a symbol of freedom, now stood against the radicalism of Paris. Napoleon, torn between his loyalty to Paoli and his service in the French army, found himself increasingly aligned with France. The rift grew painful. Paoli rejected the Bonapartes, accusing them of betrayal. For Napoleon, it was the end of a dream. His Corsican identity would remain strong, but his future lay with France. By 1793, his career began to accelerate. He was stationed in Toulon, a port city seized by royalist forces and supported by the British Navy. The French Republic, struggling to defend itself, launched a campaign to reclaim the city. Napoleon, still a young captain of artillery, played a decisive role. His careful placement of guns and his bold strategies allowed the French to drive the British fleet away and retake Toulon. The victory brought recognition. At just 24, he was promoted to brigadier general, a meteoric rise for one so young. The revolution had created chaos, but in that chaos, talent could shine. Napoleon's skill with artillery, his tireless work, and his readiness to act set him apart from others. His career was not without setbacks. His outspoken nature sometimes placed him at odds with superiors. At one point, he was briefly arrested under suspicion of political unreliability, but he was soon released. The revolution devoured many of its own, and survival required caution as well as ability. Napoleon learned to navigate these dangerous waters with care. His next great test came in Paris itself. In 1795, royalists rose against the National Convention, threatening the fragile republic. Napoleon, called to defend the government, acted decisively. He placed artillery in key positions and ordered grapeshot fired into the advancing crowds. The uprising was crushed in what became known as the chasse. Height was a harsh measure, but it saved the government. From that moment, Napoleon was recognized as a man who could be relied upon in crisis. This act brought him into the notice of the powerful. Within months, he was appointed commander of the Army of Italy, a position of immense responsibility. The young Corsican officer, once mocked for his accent and background, now held the fate of French armies in his hands. The path ahead was open, and Napoleon stepped forward with determination. He was no longer merely the boy from Ajaccio or the student at Brilliance. He was a general of France, poised at the threshold of destiny. The Italian campaign of 1796 to 1797 was the true beginning of Napoleon's legend. When he took command of the Army of Italy, its condition was poor. Soldiers were underfed, supplies were scarce, and morale was low. Many doubted that a young general, barely in his late 20s, could inspire or lead them. Yet Napoleon brought energy, clarity, and a sense of purpose. He spoke directly to his men, reminding them that though they lacked riches, the fields of Italy were abundant. Victory, he told them, would provide both honor and reward. His words were not flowery, but sharp and practical. They struck the hearts of weary soldiers, stirring hope where little had been. The campaign unfolded with swift movement and bold decisions. At Montenotte, Napoleon struck quickly, breaking the Austrian line. At Lodi, he famously led his men across a narrow bridge under fire, pressing forward despite danger. The French crossed, the enemy retreated, and Napoleon gained not only a battle, but the loyalty of his army. Later, at our call. He seized a flag and advanced through the chaos, urging his men forward. Whether the details were exaggerated by memory, the effect was real. He became the symbol of courage in action. Through a series of victories, Napoleon forced Austria to seek peace. The Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797 marked France's dominance in northern Italy. It was an extraordinary achievement for a general so young. Europe began to take notice. Keys wrote of his daring, and the Directory in Paris celebrated him as a hero. Quay's name became known beyond France, a name that carried both admiration and unease. But Napoleon's ambition did not rest. So when he looked eastward toward Egypt, in 1798, he led an expedition across the Mediterranean. Officially, it was meant to threaten British trade routes to India, yet it was also a voyage of science and discovery. With him traveled not only soldiers, but scholars, engineers, and artists. Together, they sought to explore the land of the pharaohs. The Egyptian campaign was a mixture of triumph and trial. At the Battle of the Pyramids near Cairo, Napoleon's forces defeated the Mamluks with disciplined squares of infantry. He is remembered for declaring, "From the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon us." Whether he spoke those exact words is uncertain, but the image captured the grandeur he wished to convey. In the desert, the army faced harsh heat, disease, and resistance. Meanwhile, the French fleet at Albacare Bay was destroyed by Admiral Nelson in the Battle of the Nile. The loss cut Napoleon off from France, stranding his army in a foreign land. Still, he pressed on, organizing administration, studying the antiquities, and founding the Institute of Egypt. It was during this time that the Rosetta Stone was discovered, later unlocking the language of the ancient hieroglyphs. Despite these achievements, the Egyptian campaign strained resources and morale. By 1799, news from France reached him. The Republic was unstable, threatened both by internal division and external war. Napoleon decided to return, leaving his army behind. The journey back was dangerous, but he arrived safely on French soil. When he stepped onto the shores of France, he was no longer simply a successful general. He was a figure of destiny in the eyes of many. The revolution had shaken governments, toppled kings, and left power fragile. The time was ripe for a new leader, one who could restore order without discarding the ideals of change. Napoleon's rise during these years was rapid, but it was built upon skill, calculation, and an unyielding will. He had shown himself not only as a commander of battles, but as a shaper of nations. The young Corsican officer, once caught between island loyalties and French service, was now at the center of Europe's attention. His story was moving toward its next great transformation, from general to statesman, from soldier to ruler. The revolution that had opened the door for his rise was faltering, and Napoleon was ready to step into the void it left behind. By the autumn of 1799, France was weary. A decade of revolution had left its people exhausted and uncertain. The monarchy was gone, the republic unstable, and the Directory The five-man government was deeply unpopular. Corruption, inefficiency, and constant war drained the nation's spirit. The revolution had promised liberty and stability, but instead, France seemed to drift. It was into this atmosphere that Napoleon returned from Egypt. His journey had been risky, yet he arrived to find himself welcomed, not with suspicion, but with admiration. Newspapers praised him as a victorious general. The man who had carried French arms to the sands of Egypt in a time of fear and fatigue, his presence was a beacon of strength. Behind the scenes, politicians whispered of change. The Directory was faltering, and many believed a strong leader was needed to guide France. Some feared another descent into chaos. Others longed for order. Napoleon, with his reputation, ambition, and confidence, appeared the right figure. In November 1799, an event unfolded that would forever alter France, known by the revolutionary calendar as the coup of 18 Brumaire. It was both swift and decisive. Napoleon, with the support of key allies, including his brother, Lucien, maneuvered to dismantle the Directory. At first, he attempted to persuade lawmakers with words. When persuasion faltered, soldiers entered the chambers, and resistance crumbled. Though there was confusion, the result was clear. The Directory ended, and a new government, the Consulate, was formed. At its head stood 3 consuls, but in truth, Napoleon held the power. He took the title of First Consul, a position that gave him authority over both the state and the military. The people of France, weary of instability, largely accepted this new order. They saw in Napoleon not a tyrant, but a leader who could bring calm after years of turbulence. To many, the revolution's ideals still mattered, but above all, they longed for peace and security. As first consul, Napoleon immediately began to shape France. He reorganized the administration, ensuring that officials were appointed for merit rather than influence. He reformed the legal system, laying the groundwork for what would later become the Napoleonic Code. He sought to reconcile the nation with the Catholic Church, signing a concordat with the Pope that restored harmony between faith and state. These acts were not mere politics. They were part of a vision to stabilize a country torn by division. Yet Napoleon was never content with stability alone. His mind always moved toward greater ambitions. The consulate gave him the means to govern, but it also prepared the stage for what lay ahead: the transformation of France from republic to empire. The coup of 18 Brumaire was not just a turning point in French politics. It was the threshold of Napoleon's reign, the quiet yet momentous step from soldier to ruler. In the calm of that November, a new chapter of history began, one that would carry France and Napoleon himself toward heights and trials beyond imagining. Once Napoleon secured power as first consul, the shape of France began to change. For nearly a decade, the revolution had been a storm, sweeping away monarchy, privilege, and tradition, yet leaving confusion in its place. Laws were inconsistent, finances unstable, and administration fragmented. The revolution had broken chains, but it had not built order. Napoleon understood this deeply. To govern a restless nation, he needed not only authority, but structure. His vision was clear: to weave together the ideals of the revolution: equality before the law, merit over birth, with a stable framework that could endure. What France needed was not endless upheaval, but a foundation. The most lasting of his reforms was the legal code. Before his rule, France was a patchwork of local laws, customs, and revolutionary decrees. Justice varied from one region to another. Napoleon, with a team of jurists, set about creating a single system. The result was the Code Civil de France, later known simply as the Napoleonic Code. Published in 1804, it declared that all men were equal before the law, regardless of noble birth. Property rights were protected, contracts respected, and religious freedom recognized. It swept away feudal remnants, ensuring that privilege no longer dictated justice. Yet, it was not perfect. Women, for instance, were placed under the authority of husbands and fathers, reflecting the social limits of the time. Still, the code brought clarity where there had been confusion, and it spread far beyond France. Nations across Europe, and later across the world, adopted its principles. Alongside the law, Napoleon turned to education. He believed that a strong nation required capable citizens. To that end, he created a system of state schools called. These institutions trained young men in mathematics, science, and literature, preparing them for service in administration, the military, and the professions. Education became more accessible, no longer confined to the privileged few. Finance demanded attention. Years of war had left France nearly bankrupt. Napoleon established the Bank of France in 1800, creating a stable currency and restoring confidence in the economy. He reformed taxation, ensuring it was collected fairly and consistently. Slowly, the nation regained financial health. Religion, long a source of division since the Revolution, also found a new balance. In 1801, Napoleon signed the Concordat with Pope Pius VII. The agreement recognized Catholicism as the faith of the majority of French citizens, while also guaranteeing freedom for Protestants and Jews. The Church regained influence, but it was firmly under the control of the state. Napoleon was not driven by deep faith, but by pragmatism. He knew that reconciliation would heal wounds and strengthen unity. Beyond these reforms, Napoleon reshaped administration. Prefects were appointed to govern departments, ensuring that the will of Paris reached every corner of France. Merit, not noble title, became the path to advancement. A young man of talent could now rise through the ranks of government or army, much as Napoleon himself had done. In these years, France felt a sense of renewal. Roads were repaired, commerce revived, and public works undertaken. Paris, the restless heart of the revolution, settled into a new rhythm. The people, though watchful, began to feel stability returning. Yet, even as he built, Napoleon never ceased to dream of greater things. His reforms were not merely acts of governance. Okay? They were instruments of power. Okay? By binding France together, he bound it to himself. The people began to look to him not just as a consul, but as a figure of destiny. The consulate, meant to be temporary, soon seemed permanent. Okay? In 1802, a referendum made Napoleon first consul for life. The people, weary of uncertainty, had chosen him as their anchor. For some, this choice carried unease. The revolution had promised liberty, and now one man seemed to hold it all. For others, it was a relief, a chance to breathe after years of storm. The stage was set for an even greater transformation. Napoleon, who had risen from obscurity on a Corsican island, who had marched through Italy and gazed upon the pyramids, now prepared to crown himself with a title unseen in France for a decade, emperor. And, as he looked ahead, the reforms he had built, the laws, the schools, the banks, the concordat, became the firm ground beneath his feet. They would outlive his victories and defeats, echoing long after his reign ended. In this quiet labor of governance, as much as in the roar of battle, Napoleon carved his name into history. By the dawn of the 19th century, Napoleon stood at a threshold. He was already first consul for life, already the most powerful man in France. Yet power has a way of reaching beyond its own boundaries. For Napoleon, the path that lay ahead was not merely political, it was symbolic. He wished to embody stability, strength, and legitimacy in a nation still haunted by the memory of kings and revolution. In 1804, he chose to take a step that would forever mark him in history: the creation of an empire. The idea was not his alone. Many around him urged that France needed not just a ruler, but a sovereign, someone who could anchor the new order and give it permanence. The revolution had abolished monarchy, yet the longing for unity remained. The Senate, the legislature, and the people themselves, through a plebiscite, approved the change. To a people weary of upheaval, Napoleon seemed the safest guardian of their hard-won stability. The coronation took place in December of that year, within the walls of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. The scene was one of grandeur and ceremony, a blending of the old and the new. The cathedral, echoing with music, filled with dignitaries, ambassadors, and clergy, stood as witness to a moment that seemed both ancient and modern. Pope Pius VII himself traveled to preside, lending the weight of sacred tradition. Yet Napoleon was not one to be bound by tradition alone, in a gesture that would echo through centuries. When the time came for the crown to be placed upon his head, Napoleon took it from the Pope's hands and set it upon himself. This act spoke volumes. His authority did not descend from the church, nor from any higher power. It arose from himself, from the people, from destiny as he understood it. Josephine, his devoted wife, knelt before him, and he crowned her empress, sealing their union not only in love, but in sovereignty. The new emperor was more than a monarch in the old style. He presented himself as the child of the revolution, a man who had risen by merit rather than inheritance. His empire was to be not a return to the past, but a continuation of France's transformation. Titles and honors were revived, yet they were bestowed on soldiers and statesmen who had proven themselves, not on nobles by birth. From Paris outward, Napoleon's empire began to take shape. He reorganized territories, crowned relatives and generals as kings and dukes, and sought to spread the reforms he had begun in France across Europe. Where his armies marched, the Napoleonic Code followed, sweeping away feudal structures and planting seeds of modern governance. Yet empire also meant war. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, wary of France's growing power, formed coalitions to oppose him. In the years that followed his coronation, Europe would see a succession of battles, from Austerlitz to Jena, from Wagram to Borodino. These conflicts were fought with immense cost, but always with Napoleon at the center, his presence shaping the tide of history. For the French people, however, the coronation of 1804 remained a defining memory. It was a moment of splendor, a pageant that lifted them from the uncertainties of the Revolution and placed them within the orbit of empire. Napoleon had not restored the old monarchy, but he had built something new, something uniquely his own. The empire was more than ceremony. It was a vision of order, of power, of France standing at the heart of Europe. For Napoleon, it was also deeply personal. To crown himself was to declare independence from all who might claim to command him, to assert that his rise was his own, rooted in his genius, his victories, and the will of his people. And so, within the soft glow of cathedral candles, beneath arches heavy with centuries of memory, Napoleon Bonaparte transformed himself into Napoleon the First, Emperor of the French. The echoes of that moment lingered, not just in Paris, but across the continent, setting the stage for triumphs and trials still to come. The empire, born in ceremony at Notre Dame, soon found itself tested not by symbols, but by steel. Napoleon's reign as emperor unfolded against the backdrop of nearly constant conflict, known to history as the Napoleonic Wars. These wars were not of his choosing alone. They were the outcome of long rivalries, fears, and alliances woven across Europe. Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, each in turn, and often together, opposed the expansion of France. Napoleon's vision of empire was inseparable from his vision of order. He believed in extending the reforms he had built in France, the Napoleonic Code, merit-based advancement, centralized administration, into the territories his armies reached. But this vision collided with the ambitions of other monarchies, who saw in him not only a reformer, but a conqueror. The first great test came in 1805, when a coalition of powers gathered against France. Napoleon responded with swift movement. His army, disciplined and loyal, marched with a speed that left opponents astonished. In December of that year, at the Battle of Austerlitz, also known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, Napoleon faced the combined forces of Austria and Russia. The day was cold, the fields wrapped in mist, yet his strategy was clear. Feigning weakness, he lured his enemies into overconfidence, then struck with precision. The result was a decisive victory, one of the greatest in his career. Austria was humbled, and the map of Europe began to bend to his will. The victories that followed reinforced his legend. At Jena and Auerstedt in 1806, Prussia was defeated with astonishing swiftness. The proud army of Frederick the Great collapsed in a single campaign. Napoleon entered Berlin as a master, reshaping the lands of Central Europe. By 1807, at Friedland, he brought Russia to terms, leading to the Treaty of Tilsit. Here, on a raft upon the river Niemen, Napoleon met Tsar Alexander I for a moment. The two men, one a child of revolution, the other a monarch of divine right, embraced an uneasy friendship. Europe seemed divided between them, carved like a map shared by two giants. Yet victory carried its burdens. The wars demanded constant recruitment, constant sacrifice. French soldiers, once volunteers of the Revolution, became conscripts drawn year after year into campaigns that stretched farther and farther from home. Families gave sons, towns gave resources, and still the demands grew. Britain, though defeated on land, remained unchallenged at sea. In 1805, Admiral Nelson's victory at Trafalgar secured British naval supremacy. Napoleon, unable to invade across the Channel, turned instead to economic warfare. The continental system sought to close European ports to British trade, isolating the island nation. The plan proved difficult to enforce, straining the economies of allies as much as it hurt Britain. Smuggling flourished, resentment grew, and the blockade faltered. Still, Napoleon's star burned brightly. Kay's armies marched into Spain in 1808, seeking to place his brother Joseph on the throne. Yet, here he met a resistance unlike any other. The Spanish people, aided by British forces, waged a relentless guerrilla war. Villages rose in defiance, ambushes harassed columns, and the land itself seemed hostile. The Peninsular War drained resources and morale, becoming a wound that never healed. In the East, tensions with Russia returned. The uneasy friendship with Alexander I dissolved under the strain of conflicting ambitions and the failures of the continental system. In 1812, Napoleon launched his grandest and most perilous campaign, the invasion of Russia, with the largest army Europe had yet seen, the Grandi numbering over 500,000 men from across the continent. He crossed the Niemen River. The campaign began with confidence, but unfolded with hardship. Russian forces retreated, burning villages and fields in their wake. Supply lines stretched thin, and the vast distances of the Russian land tested the endurance of even Napoleon's army. At Borodino, a brutal battle raged, leaving tens of thousands dead, but no clear victor. When Napoleon finally entered Moscow, he found the city nearly abandoned and soon engulfed by fire. The retreat that followed was catastrophic. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion decimated the Grand. From the hundreds of thousands who had set out, only a fraction returned. The campaign marked a turning point, the moment when Napoleon's star began to fade. Yet, even in defeat, his resolve endured. He raised new armies, fought new battles, and for a time held back the tide. At Leipzig in 1813, known as the Battle of Nations, the combined forces of Europe dealt him another crushing blow. Still, he returned to France, defending his homeland with skill and tenacity, though the circle around him tightened. The Napoleonic Wars were more than battles. They were a reshaping of Europe itself. Old kingdoms fell, new states arose, and ideas of equality and reform spread with the French armies, even where Napoleon's power did not last. Soldiers carried home not only memories of war, but glimpses of a different world. Through it all, Napoleon remained the center, a figure at once admired and feared, a man of vision and ambition whose presence seemed to bend events around him. His genius on the battlefield was undeniable, yet the cost was immense. By 1814, Europe stood united against him. Paris itself was occupied, and Napoleon abdicated, exiled to the small island of Elba. For a time, it seemed the story had ended, but destiny, as ever, had more to say. The year was 1812, and Napoleon stood at the height of his power. He was Emperor of the French, master of much of continental Europe, allied with some kingdoms, ruling others through his brothers and generals. Yet the empire was not secure. The alliance with Russia, sealed years earlier at Tilsit, had grown fragile. Tsar Alexander I resisted the strains of Napoleon's continental system, which sought to close Europe to British trade. The Tsar opened his ports, and the fragile partnership dissolved. Napoleon resolved on a show of force, one that would leave no doubt of his authority. He assembled the most formidable force Europe had ever seen, a vast host of over 500,000 men, drawn not only from France, but from across the empire. Italians, Poles, Germans, Dutch, and more. This was a vision of unity under his command, a tapestry of nations bound by discipline and his relentless will. In June, the army crossed the river Niemen and entered Russian lands. At first, spirits were high. The soldiers marched in tight ranks, their banners bright, their confidence unshaken. Yet the distances of Russia were unlike any they had faced before. Villages seemed to vanish into endless plains, rivers widened into obstacles, and the roads stretched far beyond sight. The Russian army under Generals Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov avoided decisive battle. They retreated steadily, drawing Napoleon deeper into the country. His towns and farms were burned as the French advanced. What might have fed the invaders was destroyed by their hosts, leaving only ashes and smoke. Hunger began to gnaw at the ranks long before winter set in. It was in early September that Napoleon found the battle he sought. Near the village of Borodino, west of Moscow, the Russian army stood to fight. The case that followed was immense, a single day of thunder, smoke, and loss. Cannon roared, infantry surged, Cavalry charged, and by nightfall, the field lay strewn with tens of thousands. Napoleon had won the ground, but it was a costly triumph, hollow in its toll. The Russian army, though battered, was not destroyed. Days later, Napoleon entered Moscow. The city, ancient and revered, stood silent and near deserted. Soon, fires broke out. Whether by design or accident remains debated, and much of Moscow was consumed by flames. The emperor waited there, hoping for a Russian surrender that never came. Messages to the Tsar went unanswered. Time stretched, food supplies dwindled, and winter drew near. By October, Napoleon knew he must retreat. The decision was heavy, for it meant abandoning the dream of bending Russia to his empire. The journey back was harsher than any could have foreseen. The Russian winter arrived early, its cold searing, its snow unrelenting. Horses collapsed, wagons broke, men fell and could not rise again. Along the roads lay frozen remnants of the proud Grand. Russian forces harassed the retreat at every turn. Cossack riders swooped from the flanks, artillery rained down, and the suffering multiplied. At the crossing of the Berezina River in November, the French faced catastrophe. Bridges collapsed under the press of men and wagons, yet somehow, through chaos and sacrifice, part of the army managed to escape. When the remnants finally staggered back beyond the Niemen, the numbers told the story. The 500,000 who had entered Russia, scarcely a fraction survived. Some estimates placed the return at fewer than 100. Ling, the Grande, once the pride of Europe, was shattered. The Russian campaign was not only a military defeat, it was a breaking of illusion. Napoleon's aura of invincibility, polished through years of triumph, was now clouded. Europe, long fearful of his power, saw at last that he could be undone. His enemies rallied, forming new coalitions with renewed determination. For Napoleon himself, the campaign was both a test of endurance and a cruel reckoning. He had gambled on speed, on his ability to compel an opponent to terms, as he had so many times before. But Russia was different. Its vastness, its people's determination, and the sheer force of nature combined against him. The story of 1812 lingers as a lesson in the limits of power. Even the greatest general, commanding the finest army, cannot bend the seasons, nor the will of a nation resolved to endure. When Napoleon returned to Paris, he worked quickly, raising new forces, preparing anew. His energy was unbroken, his resolve fierce, yet the empire was never the same. The Russian snows had left their mark, and the shadow of that winter stretched far across the years that followed. The retreat from Russia in 1812 had shaken Napoleon's empire to its core, though his determination remained unbroken. The Grande was gone. Across Europe, the air shifted. The spell of invincibility was broken, and those who had once bowed now began to rise. Prussia, long subdued, saw its moment. Russia, emboldened by survival, advanced westward. Austria, though wary, joined the coalition against him. Britain, steadfast as ever, supplied money and ships, weaving alliances into strength. The Sixth Coalition was formed, and Napoleon faced an enemy not of one nation, but of many, united by shared fear and resolve. In 1813, he gathered new forces. France still responded, though the strain was heavy. Young men barely grown, veterans worn from years of marching, all answered his call. He led them into Germany, seeking once more to bend fortune to his will. At first, his brilliance shone again. At Lutzen and Bautzen, his strategies brought victories, though not decisive enough to end the war. But the coalition grew stronger. In October of that year, near the city of Leipzig, the tide turned. The Battle of the Nations, as it came to be known, saw armies from Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden converge. It was one of the largest battles Europe had ever witnessed. For 3 days, the struggle raged. Napoleon fought with skill and courage, yet the sheer weight of numbers pressed him back. Bridges collapsed, allies faltered, and the French retreat began. Leipzig marked the decline. The losses could not be replenished, and Europe pressed forward. By 1814, Allied forces crossed into France itself. Villages and fields that had once cheered Napoleon's conquests now felt the tread of foreign armies. Yet even in these final defenses, his genius shone. At battles such as Campalbert and Montmirail, he struck with precision, winning small victories that astonished friend and foe alike. But numbers, once more, told the truth. He could not fight them all. In March 1814, Paris fell. The capital, heart of his empire, opened its gates to the coalition. His marshals, loyal for so long, urged him to see the truth. Resistance was hopeless. On April 6, Napoleon abdicated. The empire that had grown from his hand was dissolved in a stroke of pen. Yet his enemies, cautious of his spirit, did not end his life. Instead, they sent him into exile to the small Mediterranean island of Elba. There, among olive groves and rocky shores, Napoleon was given the title of sovereign of the island. It was a strange fall, from master of Europe to ruler of a fragment of land no larger than a province. On Elba, he busied himself with reforms, as if unable to rest. Roads were improved, agriculture was tended, small industries encouraged. He walked the island in his familiar uniform, speaking with locals, planning as if empire might return. His mother visited, his sister stayed close, and though the Mediterranean sun warmed him, his thoughts were never still. Across the sea, the old monarchs restored the Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, to the throne of France. Yet in Paris, whispers stirred. The return of the monarchy was uneasy. Many soldiers longed for their emperor. Many citizens remembered the reforms, the order, and the glory of his rule. The Bourbon court, by contrast, felt distant, its roots in the past. Napoleon listened. He read reports, heard rumors, and watched. His exile was meant to end his story, yet it became a pause, a silence before another storm. For even in defeat, his presence remained a force. By February 1815, the decision was made. Napoleon left Elba with a small band of loyal followers. His eyes turned once more to France. The journey ahead would bring him back to Paris and to the world's astonishment. It would bring him once more into power, if only for 100 days. In February of 1815, the quiet of Elba broke. Napoleon, restless upon the small island, set sail with a handful of soldiers, no more than a few hundred men. His destination was France, a land where his name still stirred hearts and memories. The sea journey was perilous, yet fortune carried him across the waves, and by early March he landed upon the southern coast near Cannes. From there he began his march northward, not with the grandeur of armies, but with the quiet conviction of return. Soldiers sent to arrest him found themselves swayed. At Laffrey, he stepped forward alone, opening his coat to show his chest, saying simply that if they wished, they might fire. Instead, voices rose, "Vive l'Empereur!" The ranks that had been meant to block him now marched at his side. With each day, his following grew. The Bourbon King, Louis XVIII, abandoned Paris, fleeing in haste. On March 20th, Napoleon entered the capital once more. The streets filled with cheers, the tricolor flag rose again, and for a brief moment it seemed as if time had turned back. Thus began what history remembers as the 100 Days. Yet Europe did not rest. The powers who had thought the question of Napoleon settled now gathered again. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia all renewed their alliance, determined this time to end his rule without delay. Armies began to mobilize. Napoleon, tireless in spirit, prepared to meet them. He moved swiftly, hoping to strike before the coalition forces could fully unite. In June 1815, his army marched into Belgium, seeking to defeat the British under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussians under Blucher before they could combine. At Ligny, Napoleon won a hard-fought victory against the Prussians, yet they were not destroyed. At Quatre-Bras, his marshals engaged Wellington, but the British held firm. The pieces were in motion for a final clash. On June 18th, near the village of Waterloo, the two great forces met. The day was heavy with rain, the fields thick with mud. From dawn to evening, battle thundered across the ridges and farmhouses. Napoleon's men fought with valor, their cannon roaring, their cavalry charging. Yet the ground was soft, the attacks delayed, and fortune seemed distant. The British lines under Wellington held steady, absorbing each assault. And by late afternoon, the Prussians arrived, striking at Napoleon's flank. The tide turned. The French fought desperately, but the pressure was too great. As evening fell, the army began to break. As it started as a daring gamble, ended in retreat and ruin. Waterloo was more than a battle lost. It was the final unraveling of a legend. Napoleon, once the master of Europe, was forced from the field, his army in fragments, his hopes extinguished. He returned to Paris, weary and defeated, Though he considered further resistance, it was clear the will of France and the strength of Europe were against him. On June 22, 1815, he abdicated for the second time. This time, there would be no Elba. His enemies, wary of his restless spirit, chose a more distant exile, an island far across the seas from which return would be impossible. The 100 days, though brief, shone with the brilliance and intensity that had marked his life. It was a final act of defiance, a blaze before the darkness, and, with Waterloo, the long chapter of his rule closed. In the summer of 1815, Napoleon was no longer the ruler of France, nor the commander of armies, but a captive of history. After his second abdication, he sought refuge in England, hoping perhaps for a quiet life under its watch. Yet the British government, cautious and firm, decided otherwise. They remembered Elba, the swift return, the 100 days. They would not risk it again. Instead, they chose a place far from Europe, far from the currents of politics and war, the island of St. Helena, a rocky outpost in the South Atlantic, remote, windswept, and nearly impossible to escape. It would become the final stage of Napoleon's journey. In October 1815, the ship Northumberland carried him across the ocean. The voyage took weeks, the sea stretching endlessly, the horizon unbroken. He was accompanied by a small circle of loyal companions, generals, aides, and servants, who chose to share his exile rather than leave him to solitude. Among them were General Bertrand, General Montholon, and the faithful valet marshal. St. Helena was unlike the Europe he had known. No bustling cities, no great fields of battle, no echo of empire. Instead, steep cliffs rose from the sea, and the land bore a harsh beauty, scattered with greenery and volcanic rock. The British assigned him to a residence called Longwood House, a damp and windswept building, far from comfort. Guards and sentries surrounded the island, ensuring he would never leave. Life there settled into a slow rhythm. Napoleon, though confined, maintained a sense of order. He rose early, read books on history and philosophy, walked the garden paths when weather allowed, and dictated his memories. His writings, shared with his companions, became a record of his life and reign, part justification, part reflection, and part legacy for the world beyond. The climate, however, was unkind. Longwood was often damp, its walls cold, its air heavy with mist. His health, once robust, began to falter. Stomach pains troubled him, and fatigue grew more frequent. Yet, even as his strength declined, his mind remained active. He discussed politics, strategy, and history, comparing himself to great figures of the past. He spoke of Alexander, of Caesar, of Charlemagne, measuring his own destiny against theirs. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, kept strict watch. Relations between him and Napoleon were strained, marked by mistrust and bitterness. Napoleon felt himself treated harshly, denied dignity, confined more than necessity demanded. Yet, despite these disputes, time moved forward in steady silence. Years passed. The empire that had once shaken Europe now seemed distant, almost dreamlike, as if belonging to another world. Yet visitors who came to the island, rare though they were, still found in him a presence, a sense of command that had not entirely faded. His bearing remained proud, his memory sharp, his voice steady. By 1819, his illness worsened. The stomach pains deepened, his body weakened, and long walks became rare. Still, he clung to dignity, dressing in his familiar uniform, maintaining the discipline that had guided him since youth. On May 5, 1821, after 6 years of exile, Napoleon Bonaparte passed away at the age of 51. Those by his side recorded his final hours with quiet reverence. His last words, spoken faintly, recalled France, his army, and his son. The man who had once commanded half of Europe left the world upon a remote island, far from the fields of his triumphs, far from the city he had once ruled. He was buried on St. Helena in a simple grave shaded by willow trees. Only years later, in 1840, were his remains returned to France, where they were laid to rest in Paris beneath the dome of Les Invalides. There, even now, his tomb lies, visited by countless souls, a reminder of the rise and fall of a life that reshaped the continent. Exile on St. Helena was quiet, austere, and final. Yet even in that isolation, the figure of Napoleon remained luminous, his story still echoing across Europe and beyond. The winds over St. Helena carried a steady rhythm in the spring of 1821, whispering through the island's cliffs and lonely gardens. Inside Longwood House, the figure who had once been a master of Europe lay weakened, his body failing, though his spirit still bore the calm strength that had guided him through so many storms. For months, Napoleon's health had declined. The pains in his stomach had grown sharper, his frame thinner, his days more confined to his bed. Physicians tended to him, though their remedies were limited by the medicine of their age. His companions remained loyal, watching over him with a devotion born of respect and memory. Napoleon, aware of his nearing end, gave thought to legacy and remembrance. He spoke of his wish to rest by the banks of the Seine, in the heart of France, to be near the people he had ruled and whose destiny he had sought to shape. Yet on St. Helena, such a wish could not be fulfilled. On the evening of May 5, 1821, the silence in Longwood deepened. Those around him recorded that his last words, spoken softly, invoked 3 names: France, the army. With that, the journey of Napoleon Bonaparte came to its close. He was 51 years old. The news traveled slowly across the seas, but when it reached Europe, it stirred both sorrow and relief. To some, he had been a tyrant, a bringer of endless wars. To others, he remained a hero, a visionary who had reshaped the laws, institutions, and spirit of France. On St. Helena, he was laid to rest in a secluded valley he had admired, a quiet place shaded by willows and guarded by the simple presence of nature. His tomb bore no grand inscription, only a plain stone, for there was disagreement even over what should be engraved. Yet the stillness of that spot, far from courts and capitals, seemed fitting. A man of immense ambition, brought finally to rest in the calm of solitude. For nearly 2 decades, his grave remained there, visited only by a few. Yet the memory of Napoleon grew rather than faded. In France, his legend took on new life. Romantic poets and writers spoke of him as a fallen star, a figure at once tragic and immortal. Veterans of his armies remembered their marches, their battles, their devotion to the little corporal. Across Europe, his name was invoked with both admiration and caution. In 1840, under King Louis-Philippe, permission was obtained from Britain to bring his remains back to France. The return became a solemn procession, a ceremony not just of burial, but of memory. His coffin, carried along the Seine, was greeted by vast crowds. On December 15, 1840, he was entombed in Paris, in the grand setting of Les Invalides. Beneath the great dome, his sarcophagus rests to this day, carved in stone, watched by statues of angels and generals, encircled by silence. Death closed his life in isolation, but burial restored him to the heart of the nation he had shaped. The soldier of Corsica, the emperor of France, the exile of St. Helena, all these identities were gathered into one resting place, where his story continues to draw the gaze of history. When Napoleon Bonaparte's body was returned to France in 1840 and laid beneath the dome of Les Invalides, it was not merely a burial. It was the beginning of a legend that would outlive his empire, his wars, and his own lifetime. His story, once written in the clash of cannons and the march of armies, became woven into the memory of nations, into art, law, and the imagination of people across the world. Perhaps the most enduring part of his legacy was not military at all, but legal. The Napoleonic Code, established in 1804, simplified and clarified the complex system of French laws. It abolished feudal privileges, ensured equality before the law, protected property rights, and made secular principles central to governance. Variations of this code would influence legal systems across Europe and beyond. In Belgium, Italy, Spain, parts of Germany, and even places as far away as Latin America and the Middle East. Centuries later, echoes of the code still linger, making Napoleon not only a figure of war, but also of enduring civil order. His reforms of education also left their mark. He founded schools known as aiming to create an educated citizenry and skilled administrators. He expanded the university system, supporting merit and discipline. His motives were often practical, to create loyal servants of the state. The results contributed to a stronger, more organized system of learning that endured in France long after his fall. Culturally, Napoleon became a symbol as complex as he was in life. Artists painted him in many forms: the heroic general on horseback, the statesman seated in solemn authority, the exile gazing toward a distant horizon. Writers of the Romantic Age, such as Lord Byron, Victor Hugo, and Chateaubriand, found in him the image of a tragic titan, a man who rose beyond the ordinary, only to be cast down by fate. In their verses and tales, he became less a man than a myth, embodying ambition, destiny, and the mystery of power. In politics, his name remained a touchstone. Some rulers feared it, recalling how his armies had shaken their thrones. Others admired it, seeking to imitate his style of leadership or to claim his mantle. In France, memories of him helped shape movements throughout the 19th century, even inspiring his nephew, Louis Napoleon, who would later rule as Napoleon III. Two common people, Napoleon lived on in song and story. Veterans told their children of the marches and victories, of the little corporal who shared bread with his soldiers and called them his children. Legends grew that he had not truly died, that he would one day return, a figure of hope for some, of warning for others. Beyond Europe, his image traveled widely. In Egypt, where his campaign had briefly touched the sands, his name was remembered alongside the scholars who accompanied him. Studying the monuments and recording the mysteries of the ancient land. In the Americas, leaders of independence movements looked to him as both an example and a caution proof that ambition could overthrow monarchies, but also that unchecked power could turn revolutionary fire into empire. Yet, Napoleon's legacy was not free of shadows. His wars had brought devastation to vast regions of Europe, leaving countless families in mourning. His campaigns in Spain and Russia, in particular, had sown suffering on a scale remembered with sorrow. His hunger for expansion and dominance had reshaped the continent, but at a human cost that could not be forgotten. Still, the paradox of Napoleon was this: he was both destroyer and builder, conqueror and reformer, tyrant and visionary. In him, people saw both the dangers of unchecked ambition and the brilliance of human will. Even today, his name carries weight. Historians debate him, artists reimagine him, travelers stand in silence before his tomb. He is remembered not just for the battles he fought, but for the world he left behind, a world where law was renewed, nations were redrawn, and memory itself was reshaped by the figure of one man from Corsica who dreamed too greatly to be forgotten. As twilight drapes its quiet veil across the world of history, the life of Napoleon Bonaparte lies behind us like a vast, intricate tapestry. From the Corsican cradle, where he first opened his eyes, to the grand halls of empire, where he crowned himself in splendor, to the lonely exile upon a distant Atlantic rock, his journey was as immense as the seas he once crossed. And yet, as we look back, what lingers is not merely the march of armies or the echo of cannons. It is the story of a man who rose from obscurity to shape the destiny of nations. It is the image of a restless spirit, always moving, always reaching, always believing that the world could bend to will and vision. In the hush of night, his tale softens. The battles fade into the distance, their noise giving way to silence. What remains is a sense of human striving, the courage and the frailty, the brilliance and the limits. Napoleon's triumphs remind us of the power of determination, while his downfall whispers the truth that even the mightiest are bound by time and fate. His body rests beneath the dome of Les Invalides, surrounded by marble and shadow, where visitors pass in hushed steps. But his story does not sleep. It moves through laws still practiced, through books still read, through the imagination of countless generations who see in him either warning or wonder. For us, here in the gentle embrace of evening, Napoleon's tale becomes something else. Not a chronicle of war, but a meditation on the arc of human ambition. How brief it is, how radiant, how fragile. His life, like all lives, moves from the cradle to the grave, leaving behind a trace that time cannot quite erase. And so, as the stars turn once more above us, we let go of the emperor and the exile alike. We allow his story to rest, as we ourselves prepare for rest. The past has spoken, quietly and clearly. Its voice softens into the silence of night, carrying with it both the grandeur and the humility of the human journey. Here, at Nightfall Royals, we close the chapter, the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, with its heights and depths, its brilliance and its shadows, settle within you like a distant lullaby, a reminder of history's endless song. And may that song guide you gently toward peace, toward stillness, toward dreams. Good night.